I met Alara on a rain-soft afternoon, the kind that blurs the edges of the world and makes everything feel temporary. The cafe was nearly empty, holding the quiet like a secret. She sat by the window, fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, eyes following raindrops as they slid down the glass. I didn't plan to sit across from her. My body moved before my thoughts caught up, drawn by something I didn't have a name for yet. When she looked up, her surprise softened into a hesitant smile. "Do you mind?" she asked gently. "It's just loud in my head today." I shook my head. Mine too. That was all it took. No introductions. No forced conversation. Just two strangers sharing the same silence. It felt oddly intimate, like we'd skipped past the usual formalities and landed somewhere quieter, deeper. She broke the silence first. Her voice was soft, careful, as if she chose each word with intention. I noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she thought, the faint sadness resting in her smile. She noticed me too. I could feel it in the way her eyes lingered, not curious, but familiar, like recognition. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, time slowed. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated. "I'm Alara," she said, like the name mattered. I told her mine, my heart beating faster than it should have. She glanced at the empty chair between us. "Same time tomorrow?" The question felt heavier than it should have. I nodded anyway. "I'll be here." As she walked away, the warmth she left behind lingered in the air. The chair across from me felt empty, but not cold. Something invisible had settled between us, quiet but undeniable. I didn't know her yet. I didn't know what she would become to me. But as I watched the rain fall, I knew one thing with sudden clarity. Something had just begun. We began to meet without calling it anything. Same cafe, same window, different afternoons stitched together by habit. It felt natural, the way breathing does. You don't notice it until you imagine stopping. Alara would arrive first sometimes, already holding 2 cups, as if she'd known I was coming. Other days I'd find her sketching quietly, her focus so complete it felt intimate just to watch her. We talked about small things at first. Books we never finished, cities we missed, the comfort of rainy weather, until those small things slowly opened into larger truths we hadn't meant to share. With Alara, silence wasn't something to escape. It rested easily between us, warm and unthreatening. Our knees brushed under the table more often now, and neither of us moved away. I noticed how she smiled wider when she laughed without thinking, how her eyes softened when she looked at me, like she wasn't just seeing me but settling into me. One evening, the cafe closed early, and we stepped outside into streets washed clean by rain. The city felt quieter, as if it were listening. "Walk with me," she said, not quite a question. We walked without a destination, our steps falling into the same rhythm. She told me she hated goodbyes, that she always left before things could leave her first. I admitted I stayed too long in places that no longer wanted me. She stopped walking then, turned to face me, and for a moment the world narrowed to just us. "I feel safe with you," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain had been earlier. My chest tightened. "Me too," I replied, surprised by how true it felt. We didn't touch. We didn't kiss. Yet something settled quietly into place. That night, lying alone, I realized I was already looking for her in empty chairs, in passing songs, in the calm spaces of my thoughts. She wasn't just becoming familiar. She was becoming necessary. By the 3rd week, closeness had stopped feeling accidental. We sat nearer now, shoulders brushing, knees aligned beneath the table like they belonged that way. Conversation drifted easily, but it was the pauses that carried the most weight. Sometimes Alara would watch me while I spoke, not interrupting, not nodding, just listening in a way that made me feel carefully held. I found myself choosing my words differently around her, softer, more honest, as if my body knew she would keep them safe. One afternoon, I wrote the word home on a napkin without realizing why. Alara noticed, her gaze lingering on it before her fingers reached out. She traced the letters slowly on my wrist, her touch light but intentional, sending a quiet heat through me. "Do you believe in that?" she asked. I swallowed, my voice unsteady as I answered, I think sometimes home isn't a place. It's a person. Her fingers paused, but she didn't pull away, and in that stillness something fragile and unspoken stretched between us. That evening, she came to my apartment. The space was small, but she filled it effortlessly, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a mug of tea, laughing at something I said like it mattered. A movie played in the background, forgotten almost immediately. When she leaned her head against my shoulder, it happened so naturally that neither of us reacted at first. Her warmth seeped into me, calming and dangerous all at once. I stayed still, afraid that any movement might break the moment. "You're tense," she murmured, her breath brushing my collarbone. "I don't want to scare you," I admitted quietly. She lifted her head, eyes searching mine. "You couldn't." Our faces were close enough that I could feel her breath, close enough that the question between us felt unbearable. For a heartbeat, I thought she might close the distance. Instead, she leaned back slowly, her expression gentle but firm. "Not yet," she whispered. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. By the third week, closeness had stopped feeling accidental. We sat nearer now, shoulders brushing, knees aligned beneath the table like they belonged that way. Conversation drifted easily, but it was the pauses that carried the most weight. Sometimes Alara would watch me while I spoke, not interrupting, not nodding, just listening in a way that made me feel carefully held. I found myself choosing my words differently around her, softer, more honest, as if my body knew she would keep them safe. One afternoon, I wrote the word home on a napkin without realizing why. Alara noticed, her gaze lingering on it before her fingers reached out. She traced the letters slowly on my wrist, her touch light but intentional, sending a quiet heat through me. "Do you believe in that?" she asked. I swallowed, my voice unsteady as I answered, I think sometimes home isn't a place. It's a person. Her fingers paused, but she didn't pull away, and in that stillness something fragile and unspoken stretched between us. That evening, she came to my apartment. The space was small, but she filled it effortlessly, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a mug of tea, laughing at something I said like it mattered. A movie played in the background, forgotten almost immediately. When she leaned her head against my shoulder, it happened so naturally that neither of us reacted at first. Her warmth seeped into me, calming and dangerous all at once. I stayed still, afraid that any movement might break the moment. "You're tense," she murmured, her breath brushing my collarbone. "I don't want to scare you," I admitted quietly. She lifted her head, eyes searching mine. "You couldn't." Our faces were close enough that I could feel her breath, close enough that the question between us felt unbearable. For a heartbeat, I thought she might close the distance. Instead, she leaned back slowly, her expression gentle but firm. "Not yet," she whispered. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. Loving Alara didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in small, deliberate moments, like learning a language through touch and tone rather than words. I learned how she took her coffee darker when she was anxious, how she folded inward when too many thoughts crowded her chest. She learned that my silences weren't distance, just places where I gathered myself. With her, I didn't have to explain every pause. She understood them instinctively. We spent long nights talking until the sky softened into morning, our bodies close but unhurried. Sometimes we kissed, slow and exploratory, as if every brush of lips carried meaning. Other times, intimacy lived in simpler gestures, her head resting on my chest, my fingers tracing idle patterns along her back, the quiet rhythm of breathing shared between us. Being near her felt grounding, like coming home after a long day without realizing how tired I'd been. One evening, curled together on my bed, she traced circles on my arm, absent-minded but tender. "I've never felt this," she said softly. "This calm." Her voice carried a hint of disbelief, like she didn't quite trust the feeling yet. I kissed her hair, breathing her in, and admitted, me neither. It felt like a confession, fragile and sincere. She shifted slightly, looking up at me, her expression suddenly serious. "Promise me something," she said. I felt the weight in her words before she finished. If it hurts, we say it. If it scares us, we don't disappear. I hesitated only for a moment, the familiar urge to run flickering briefly before settling. Then I nodded. I promise. Her shoulders relaxed, relief softening her features. She smiled, small but genuine, and settled back against me, as if reassured that we were building something real, not just something beautiful. That night, as sleep claimed us slowly, I understood that love wasn't always loud or overwhelming. Sometimes it was quiet understanding, shared vulnerability, and the courage to stay present. Love didn't fall apart suddenly. It thinned quietly in places I didn't know to watch. Ilara still came over, still kissed me goodnight, but something in her had begun to pull inward. Her laughter arrived slower. Her eyes wandered more often, as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. I told myself it was nothing, just stress, just life, but my heart knew before my mind caught up. She stopped staying the night. When she did, sleep came late and left early. Her phone buzzed with unanswered messages she didn't explain. I tried not to ask too much, afraid of sounding insecure, afraid of becoming heavy in her hands. But love has a way of pressing on the chest when it senses distance. One evening, unable to hold it in anymore, I asked, "Are you pulling away from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat beside me, staring at the floor like it might offer guidance. "I'm scared," she finally said. "Of me?" The question escaped before I could soften it. She looked up quickly, pain flickering across her face. "No. Of how much this matters. Of how deeply I'm already in this." Her voice shook, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't doubt. It was fear wearing familiar clothes. I reached for her hand, grounding us both. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, though part of me wasn't sure I knew how to keep that promise. She squeezed my fingers, holding on like she needed proof. "I know," she whispered. But knowing didn't fix the distance. It hovered between us, quiet and heavy. That night, when she left earlier than usual, the light in my apartment felt harsher, the silence less kind. I lay awake, replaying her words, realizing something painful and true. Love wasn't just safety and warmth. Sometimes it was standing still while the person you loved wrestled with shadows you couldn't fight for them. And for the first time since meeting Ilara, I wondered if staying might hurt more than leaving. She didn't come to the cafe. At first, I told myself she was running late, that she'd appear any minute with that soft apology smile she wore when she felt guilty for things that weren't her fault. I waited longer than I should have, my coffee cooling untouched in front of me, the empty chair across from me growing heavier with every passing minute. When she still didn't come, something inside me sank quietly, like it had been expecting this all along. Days passed without seeing her. Messages became brief, careful, as if every word had to cross a fragile bridge before reaching me. When she finally called, her voice sounded distant, already halfway gone. "I think I need some space," she said, and the words landed gently but left bruises all the same. I swallowed hard. "Okay." It was the only answer I could give without breaking. "I don't want to lose you," she added quickly, panic threading through her voice. "You won't," I said, though the lie tasted bitter. Because it already felt like I was losing her. We met once more, standing outside her building beneath a sky that felt too open, too indifferent. She looked smaller somehow, folded into herself, arms wrapped tight as if holding on to what little certainty she had left. When we hugged, it lingered, her head tucked beneath my chin, her breath uneven against my neck. I memorized the weight of her, the familiar comfort of her presence, afraid it might be the last time. "I don't know how long," she whispered. "Take the time you need," I replied, even as my heart protested. When she pulled away, she didn't look back. I didn't follow. Letting her go felt like stepping out of a warm house into winter without a coat, but I stood still, forcing myself to respect the distance she needed. As I walked home alone, I realized something painful and undeniable. Home isn't just where you feel safe, it's where you're allowed to stay. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I still belonged in hers. Life kept moving, but it did so without color. Without Ilara, The days blurred together, quiet and hollow in ways I hadn't known before. The cafe still stood on the corner, unchanged, but I stopped going. I couldn't face the empty chair by the window or the way the light fell exactly where she used to sit. Some absences are louder than presence ever was. My apartment echoed with her memory. The mug she preferred stayed untouched in the cupboard. The blanket we shared still carried the faint warmth of her, and I hated myself for noticing. Songs we once listened to together became unbearable, each note tugging at something raw inside my chest. Even the smallest things rain against the glass. The smell of coffee, the quiet moments before sleep, carried her shape. I tried to distract myself. I worked longer hours, filled my evenings with noise, with people who asked questions I didn't want to answer. But grief has a way of finding you in silence. At night, when everything slowed, I replayed our conversations, searching for the moment where things had begun to crack, wondering if I could have held her closer, steadied her better. Weeks passed like this, stretched thin by longing. I stopped checking my phone as often, pretending that helped. It didn't. Her absence settled into me, not sharp anymore, but heavy, like something I carried everywhere without choice. I missed her laugh, the way she said my name, the calm she brought just by being near. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by my window and watched the rain fall, the city glowing softly below. I realized then that loving her had changed me in ways I couldn't undo. She wasn't just someone I missed. She was woven into my days, into my sense of self. And as much as I tried to move forward, part of me remained still, waiting quietly, stubbornly, for something I couldn't name. That was when the knock came. The knock startled me, sharp against the quiet of the apartment. For a moment, I stayed where I was, heart racing, afraid of hoping. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and yet something in me already knew. When I opened the door, Alara stood there, hair damp from the rain, eyes red and shining, as if she'd been holding herself together only long enough to reach me. "I'm sorry," she said before I could speak. Her voice broke on the second word, and all the distance of the past weeks collapsed into that single moment. I didn't think. I pulled her into my arms, feeling her exhale shakily against my shoulder. She cried quietly, the kind of crying that comes from exhaustion more than pain, and I held her like she might disappear again if I loosened my grip. "I was wrong," she whispered. "Running didn't make it safer. It just made it lonelier." We sat on the couch, knees touching, hands entwined like we were relearning something familiar. She told me how fear had followed her everywhere, how the thought of losing herself in love had felt unbearable. "But losing you felt worse," she admitted, eyes searching mine with raw honesty. "I was scared too," I said, my thumb brushing her knuckles. "I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like goodbye." She smiled weakly. "Can we try again?" The question was fragile, hopeful, and terrified all at once. I leaned in, resting my forehead against hers. "We never stopped trying," I said softly. Our kiss was slower than before, steadier. It carried apology and intention, a promise without words. She stayed that night, curled into me like she'd always belonged there. When sleep finally claimed us, it felt different, earned, peaceful. As I listened to her breathing in the dark, I understood something essential. Coming back wasn't about erasing the fear or the hurt. It was about choosing each other anyway. And this time, we both stayed. After that night, we moved slowly, deliberately, as if we were learning to breathe together again. Fear lingered in the corners of our love, but it no longer dictated our steps. We argued sometimes, yes, quiet frustrations and old insecurities surfacing, but instead of running or retreating, we faced them. We learned how to speak without hurting, how to hold space for each other's silences, how to love without losing ourselves. Morning light became our favorite companion. I'd wake to find her fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm, eyes still heavy with sleep but filled with trust. "You feel like home," she whispered one morning, voice soft and certain. I smiled, heart swelling, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You always were," I said, and it was true in every way that mattered. We began building rituals, small things that tethered us together. Morning coffee shared in silence, Late-night walks when the city glimmered under streetlights, and lazy afternoons spent reading on the couch. There were no grand gestures, no need for declarations. Love had become ordinary, steady, and extraordinary all at once. Evenings were the most intimate. Sometimes we would sit on the floor, backs against the couch, knees brushing, hands intertwining, letting the quiet do the talking. There was no rush, no urgency, just presence. It was in these moments, more than anywhere else, that I understood the depth of what we had. It wasn't passion alone that made us whole. It was trust, patience, and the willingness to be raw and unguarded. One night, lying in the darkness, I traced her face with my fingers, memorizing the curve of her lips, the softness of her jaw, the familiar warmth of her skin. "I want this," I whispered. "Us. Always." She smiled against my chest, her eyes closing. "Always," she repeated, and in that word, I felt everything, every fear, every doubt, every longing fall into place. In choosing each other every day, we found that love wasn't just a feeling. Home, I realized, wasn't a building, a city, or a fixed point on a map. Home was in the quiet moments, the unspoken understanding, the gentle touches that required no explanation. With Alara, home was in shared routines and laughter echoing through empty rooms, in whispered confessions at midnight, in the simple act of being near each other without trying to fix anything. It was in the way she moved through my apartment barefoot, humming softly to herself as though she belonged there, and in the way I learned not to run from her silences, but to sit with her, letting her find her words in her own time. Home was also in the arguments, in the cracks of our stubbornness, in learning to bend without breaking, to apologize without shame, to forgive without forgetting. I watched her one evening as she leaned against the kitchen counter, stirring tea, her hair messy and falling into her eyes, and I felt it again, the deep certainty that this was where I belonged. It wasn't just comfort, it was recognition. She had settled into me the way I had into her, and in that, we found an unshakable rhythm. Sometimes, we sat by the window when rain came, letting the world outside blur and fade. She'd press her forehead to mine, fingers entwined, and we'd simply exist together. Those moments were ordinary, yet they carried an extraordinary weight. They were proof that home isn't about perfection. It's about presence. I began to understand that loving her meant more than wanting her. It meant choosing her, every day, even when fear crept in, even when the past lingered, even when the future was uncertain. And choosing her was the easiest thing in the world, because in every touch, every glance, every quiet sigh shared between us, she was home. Alara wasn't a place I arrived at. She was the safe harbor, the warmth, the constancy I'd been searching for without knowing. And as long as we had each other, I knew that home wasn't something I'd ever lose. Years passed, but some things never changed. Rain still made the city glow softly, cafe chairs still waited quietly for strangers, and we still found ourselves seeking each other out in the small, ordinary corners of life. But now, when I looked at Alara, I saw not just the girl who had walked into my life on a rainy afternoon, but the person who had become my anchor, my constant, my home. We still held hands as we walked, still shared late-night talks that spilled into laughter and quiet sighs. The passion was there, yes, but it had deepened into something steadier, stronger, a love that had been tested, frayed at the edges, and yet remained unbroken. Every morning I woke beside her, every night I fell asleep with her fingers laced in mine. I was reminded that home isn't a place you reach. It's a presence, a heartbeat, a soul that fits perfectly against your own. She leaned into me one evening, her head on my chest, voice soft with sleepiness. "Remember when we were afraid?" she whispered. I kissed her temple, heartful. "We still are," I murmured. "But we stayed," she said. And that was the difference. Staying. Choosing. Loving despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite the quiet moments that once threatened to tear us apart. In staying, in choosing each other, we discovered the truest meaning of love. I realized then, with perfect clarity, that Alara wasn't just someone I loved. She wasn't a fleeting warmth or a temporary place to rest. She was home. In her arms, in her presence, in every quiet glance and gentle touch, I had found the place I'd been searching for my entire life. She was home to me. And I was finally home too.